Well, I want to welcome those of you who've been in our waiting room. We're so grateful to have you join us for this national Zoom call. We do this every Thursday at 3 o'clock Central Time. We have an outstanding guest, as we attempt always to do. I'll be introducing Mr. Matt Staver in just a moment. Before we do, I always like to, for the sake of the first-time participants, talk a little bit about the Jonathan Project, which sponsors these calls. Jonathan Project was a vision in the heart of Mr. Peter Hershen, who is famous for his theme parks across the United States. He owns family-oriented theme parks of a great magnitude in 10 states across the country, including Dollywood in Tennessee. He also owns Silver Dollar City in Branson, Missouri, as well as the Globetrotters that all of us at some time in our childhood or adulthood have seen perform, either in person or on national television. You can study the theme parks and determine that this is a committed Christian entrepreneur. He's invested his life in providing places where families with values can go and not be offended. And for that, we can all be grateful. But in his latter years, he began asking questions like many of us have asked. Why is America growing so dark? Why does it seem the church's voice is being silenced? And of course, the answer to that, for those of us who've been involved in this process over time, is the fact that the church isn't engaging in public policy. We bought this lie that you can't mix church and state. In fact, I've written extensively on this subject and spent the last quarter of my life trying to debunk the myth that pastors cannot engage in anything political. We're going to be hearing from a legal expert today who's uniquely gifted to talk to that issue because he's both a pastor as well as a esteemed attorney. He's a brilliant man of God. He's acquired great skill theologically, but he also is one of the best in the courtroom. And so we're going to hear from him in just a moment about cases right now he is defending. But the Jonathan Project was birthed in the heart of Mr. Peter Hershen, who took some of his wealth, brought together some of the great legal minds in the state of Missouri, along with committed pastors, in some cases very highly recognized pastors, sequestered them and said, design a program that won't frighten churches, that would encourage pastors to encourage their people to engage in politics. The outcome of those days away was the Jonathan Project. In fact, I was offered a position with Jonathan Project the first year they were formed in 2016, but at the time I was quite comfortable managing Vision America. Didn't foresee that the day would ever come when I wouldn't be associated with that national ministry. In 2018, I moved to Washington, D.C., spent 18 months teaching Bible studies and to members of Congress and fulfilling a lifelong goal to see how Washington, D.C. works. I discovered it was every bit the swamp that it's been described as being. I also developed even a deeper respect for Matt Staver, who became a neighbor right across the street in a condo that we were living in, where he rented a condo for his office, his national office in Washington, D.C. But during those 18 months that I commuted back and forth, the hunger to engage pastors and the grander understanding of how important pastors are if America is ever going to be redeemed was rebirthed. And so having handed the reins to Vision America to another, I then went back and founded recoveramerica.org, Recover America Now, I should say, .org. But Mr. Hershen heard that I was no longer associated with Vision America. So the second attempt to acquire services was extended. In January of this year, the COO came to my home, sat down with Tommy and I. The outcome of that was I saw really the fulfillment of everything I'd worked for the past 20 plus years in terms of moving churches. Unlike Vision America, which had a broad outreach to a lot of issues and was very issue-oriented, the Jonathan Project has one focus, and that's to find every unregistered Christian who holds values and give them the opportunity to be registered. What Mr. Hershen created was the best operation for voter registration that I have seen or know of, and I have seen them all, I think. Unlike other ministries, we're not competing for finances. We're not trying to brand ourselves. We offer everything we have to the local church free of charge, whether it's the videos that are excellently produced that you can brand as your own, or providing you with people who actually work with your people, staffing and training staff members as we pay their salary. They train your staff members in how to actually register the people. And we even have the technology to tell you everyone in your church who's not registered. So it's no guessing game. We can give you a list or provide the volunteers or staff members you've assigned. They know who to reach out to. And our goal is to find every unregistered member of a committed church under the leadership of their pastor, using the means they choose to register those voters. We can then we have the technology that's available to anyone, by the way, it's just quite expensive. But we have the technology then after an election to give a list to the pastor of who in his church voted. We don't know, no one knows, it's not public how they voted. We're not interested in finding that out. We just know that if people in Bible preaching churches go to the polls and vote, overwhelmingly they'll vote for the conservative candidate or the candidate that reflects their values, and that's what we're looking for. I know that no one has been more important in the battle for securing the rights for Christians to vote and defining what Christians can and cannot do than my friend Matt Staver. Just a short word of a very long resume. Matt Staver is one of the leading attorneys in America, has argued before the Supreme Court, seldom if ever loses a case. He's published over 300 legal opinions, including opinions that were presented to the Supreme Court. He's the host of Faith and Freedom, a podcast that airs regularly, as well as Freedom's Call radio program. And he, prior to law school, attended seminary. He has the distinction of having written and having approved one of the longest dissertations, theological dissertations ever written, was #1 in his class, continues to pastor, continues to preach while conducting his law practice. And he and his wife both are trained attorneys. Anita was one of the, I think she was the president, correct me on this if you will, Matt, but had a very high position at Liberty Law School, which they assisted in founding. But Matt, it is a blessing to have you with us today. The floor is yours, my friend. Talk to us about what you do and some of the cases you're arguing right now.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rick. It's good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me, and the feeling to you, and as a friend, as a Christian brother, and as someone who is making a difference, has made a difference in mobilizing, educating pastors. I know your story about how you got involved because of what was happening in your local public school, and you went to that board meeting and were just literally shocked about what you heard there. And that is what began your involvement in the community.
Correct.
And I just want to thank you for hosting this for the Jonathan Project. You know, this issue, and I'll maybe sandwich what I'm going to say with the importance of voting and getting people registered to vote, both at the beginning and at the end of my message. But it is so important, so critically important. What we see right now with the issue of churches, and we're doing a lot of different cases regarding churches and the restrictions that they're facing around the country. What we're seeing right now, and you're going to see this even more clear, as some of the states begin to open. Say, for example, Rick, your state of Texas, my state of Florida. You're going to see a contrast, and you've already seen this. You're going to see it even greater. The states that are continuing the restrictions, particularly the most egregious restrictions against churches, have a political ideology, and that is they're run by Democratic governors, but particularly those governors are very radical pro-abortion. Correct. That is, if they don't respect the sanctity of human life, Rick, as you know, they're not going to respect your religious freedom or anything regarding your freedom. If they don't respect the most important right that we have, the right to life, the inalienable right that comes from our Creator, that we are created in the image of God, therefore we have dignity and we have the right to life, then they're not going to respect our freedom. And so that's Absolutely. What you're seeing. And I'll wrap that up and kind of tie that in. But let me just give you some cases that are going on right now. There's a lot of them. We're talking to over 1,000 pastors around the country about what's happening. Pastors in California and other pastors this Palm Sunday, they're going to open their churches for the very first time, notwithstanding the restrictions in those states that say you can't. Let me just say this before I talk about some of the cases. I've reviewed thousands of these executive orders from the governors and from local governments, and they've been amended and they've been amended and amended. I haven't found a single one with regards to the restriction on churches that is constitutional. The government does not have the right to dictate the manner and form of worship. Doesn't have the right to dictate how you're going to worship, online versus in person or in the parking lot. And that's not within the government's purview. Doesn't have the right to be able to dictate the manner and the form of worship. And even the Supreme Court case, the very first one on the Establishment Clause, 1947, Everson case. Everson case says that the Establishment Clause means at least this. It means that neither the state nor the federal government, they said, can force someone to attend church or to stay away from church against his will. That's what the Supreme Court of the United States said back in 1947, and that's exactly what's happening, forcing people to stay away from church against their will.
Repeat that case. That's the first I've heard that, and I've been listening and watching. That's an important case to cite. It's a very important case to cite. In fact, we just filed yesterday, and I'll talk about the case, with the United States Supreme Court. The case is currently before Justice Kavanaugh. He is over the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which governs Illinois and Indiana, some of those surrounding states, Wisconsin. They're under the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Each one of those circuit courts of appeals have a justice assigned to it, and those justices entertain emergency motions. And we filed an emergency motion yesterday around 3:15, 3:30 or so Eastern time. Within 2.5 hours, or just a little bit more, at 6 o'clock, Justice Kavanaugh ordered the governor of Illinois to respond by 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time tonight. So in that particular briefing that we filed as an emergency asking for an injunction pending the appeal, we cited that case front and center, and we've been citing it front and center on all of our pleadings recently. But it is a strong opinion. Name the case again, please. It's Everson versus Board of Education, 1947. And it says that if the Establishment Clause means anything, no, it says the Establishment Clause means at least this. And it lists some of the things that the Establishment Clause at a minimum means. And it says neither a state nor the federal government may force someone to attend church or force them to stay away from church against his will. That's directly from the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's exactly what's happening. So let me tell you about the case that we represent. We represent a lot of them, but we talk about the one in Illinois that we just filed with the Supreme Court yesterday afternoon. These are Romanian churches, and that's important in and of itself, just to understand the background of the Romanians. These are Romanian pastors. They immigrated from communist Romania. And in communist Romania, churches were bulldozed. In fact, Christians were constantly mocked. They were ridiculed. Pastors were routinely arrested if they preached off the government-approved script. In Timisoara, the town in which Horatio Mahet, our chief litigation counsel, lived, his dad was a pastor in Romania. That's where they lived, in Timisoara. 2 weeks before December 25, 1989, a pastor was arrested. And instead of the people just going away like they normally did, because pastors got arrested routinely and the Christians didn't stand up. On this particular occasion, they went out in front of this pastor's home and they prayed and they prayed and they prayed. Nightfall came and they continued to pray. They began to shout, "We need God." And they began to shout libertate, which is liberty in Romanian. And eventually, the several 100,000 people came out into the town and they began to participate in this prayer. Then other places in Romania saw what was happening in Timisoara. Harry Mahet at the time was a 12-year-old boy. He had longed to come to America because America was the land of the free. And he had longed to be able to come into a place where churches were full and you could have freedom of religion. He also dreamed of sometime coming to America to become an attorney so he could defend churches and religious freedom. This was Harry at a 12-year-old boy, 1989. Well, this started happening throughout Romania. In Bucharest, the communist dictator Ceausescu called a meeting. He was going to crush it. And instead, during his speech, people started shouting the same thing. And they interrupted his speech, libertate and we need God.
He took off in his helicopter, but he was captured. He was tried, and he was ultimately convicted and hung within a 24-hour period. On December 25, 1989, Harry Mahed, as a 12-year-old boy, experienced his first day of freedom. And that's the background of these Romanians. They came to America because they love this country. They immigrated here legally, and these pastors that we represent are in Chicago. So like other pastors, they said, well, we don't know a lot about this COVID-19. We're just going to stand down. We're going to stop the in-person service. We're going to do online services. Some churches don't have that capability. These did. And then it went on. It got extended, and it got extended. And eventually the governor said, well, you can have 10 people. Doesn't matter whether you have 50 sanctuary that seats 50 people or 5,000. 10 people. Doesn't matter, across the board. But, abortion clinics, they say, are essential. The liquor stores are essential.
Right.
Walmart, Kmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, you name it, all the big box centers, they're essential, and they're always packed, always packed. Parking lots are full. The stores are full. They've been like Christmas for months. So what happened is they said, we're going to write a letter to the governor, and we're going to tell the governor that we've been good citizens, but we're going to open up. And they did a couple of weeks ago. And they did. And consequently, we filed a federal lawsuit at the federal court. The case now is still at the Court of Appeals. They're fast-tracking it. They really fast-tracked it. They didn't give us the injunction pending the appeal, but they've expedited it. They've crunched in about a 3-week period, what would normally take months or even over a year. That's nice, but it's not helping in this particular case. Because this past Saturday, what happened was at the direction of the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, and of the governor, J.B. Pritzker, those individuals, the governor's orders, say no more than 10 people. And by the way, if you're ever going to even get close to 50 people, it's going to take 12 to 18 months. And that's only going to happen whenever they have the tracing, testing, and a mandatory vaccine that's widely available. So the churches are way down the road. These churches began to meet. This past Saturday, they received a letter from the Chicago Board of Public Health demanding, well, first of all, labeling church attendance a, quote, public nuisance, a public nuisance. That term gives them extraordinary powers. And in the letter, they say that, in fact, I have the letter right here. In the letter, they say that I have the authority. I will exercise whatever power is necessary. I will stop this public nuisance. And they also say, I will actually go up to and including summary abatement. Now, summary abatement in Illinois is very clear. The Illinois Supreme Court said what it is, and it means destruction of the building. This is an official letter from Chicago's Public Health Department declaring attendance at a church of more than 10 people, anything more than 10 people is a public nuisance, and we will exercise whatever authority, including the destruction of your building. And because of that, we're asking the Supreme Court for immediate intervention to give us an injunction pending the appeal. In a few hours, the governor's attorneys are ordered to respond, and then Justice Kavanaugh, who's over that circuit, will make a decision. So pray for that case. But let's ratchet back just a couple more days before that. Before they did this letter, they ended up, the week before, on Sunday, they put no parking signs for a 9-block radius around these Romanian churches, 9 blocks. And they put no parking signs from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. And then they sent out letters to all the neighbors saying the reason why you can't park there, and if you do, by the way, you'll be towed, is because this particular church, they named it, gave the address, is having meetings against the governor's order. Now, they were trying to get the neighborhood mad at the churches. Clearly. And what happened is the neighbors' cars that didn't get out of the way in time, they were all towed as soon as 7 a.m. came, including a nurse. She came home at 4 a.m., parked her car in front on the street parking, and came out just a little after 7 a.m., and her car is gone. And she didn't know where it went. She had to, instead of resting, buying groceries, whatever, that Sunday, she had to now go find her car and pay for the penalty. The thing is that the church doesn't use the street parking. So when the mayor found that out, she went to Plan B. Plan B was they sent out squad cars, police cars. They blocked the entrance to the private parking lot of the church. Wouldn't let anybody in. Facebook Live actually was filming it at the time, and while that was happening, you could hear 3 gunshots in the distance. Not against this church, but somewhere in the vicinity where you could hear the gunshots echoing through the city. But did the police cars move? No, they're still blocking the Christians. 3 police cars, maybe a 4th, completely blocking the entrance. Instead of going after the criminals, they're doing this to the pastors and to the churches. Then, since the people saw that they couldn't get in the parking lot, they dropped off their families. They drove for blocks, walked back in the cold and rain, and attended the church. So it didn't stop them for the Sunday evening. And then what they did is they gave the pastors 2 disorderly conduct charges. Disorderly conduct for conducting a church service. And then they gave them this letter that they would do summary abatement, which includes destruction of the building. I mean, these are people that have witnessed destruction of church buildings, but in communist Romania. Never would they dream it would happen here.
I've heard of some of this because I follow your emails and follow your work. But this detail, is anybody telling the story? Are you getting any kind of support from anyone in the press anywhere?
Yeah, Todd Starnes has been reporting on it, and he's been doing a very good job. And some other media have, but you don't see this on some of the mainstream media. You don't see these details. Todd Starnes is probably the only one that's been reporting these kind of details.
Well, we gave Todd Starnes our highest award at Vision America a gala several years ago because of his commitment to Christ. So that doesn't surprise me. Good for him.
No, I mean, he's been doing a great job. We need more reporters like Todd to get this word out because it's absolutely shocking. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. And this to happen to Romanian immigrants is even worse.
Have you considered putting out a call for pastors from around the country to come to that city and rally to these guys? Because I'll promise you I'd be there.
Well, and let's do that right now. I think there was a pastor that came to speak there last week to stand up with this pastor. But we need pastors from around the country, pastors to come here and rally with this pastor. I can tell you what, Pastor Christian Anascu, and he's one of our pastors, and he's the lead pastor of Elam Romanian Pentecostal Church. The other one is the Logos Baptist Ministries Church. And the pastors are absolutely strong. They're unwavering. And they understand the importance of starting church. They understand the importance of in-person worship service. Look, there's some things that you just simply can't do online. Correct. Let me give you an example of a church. This is not a litigation, but it could be. It's in New York. A pastor there of a smaller church. And let me back up a second. What these churches are doing are model examples of opening with sanitizing and social distancing. You ought to see the efforts that these people have gone through. I mean, extraordinary efforts to protect the health and welfare of the people. With the social distancing, the sanitizing, and the care for their people, it's literally a model that the government should actually bring these people to the table and say, we need to learn from you, rather than treat them as criminals and try to threaten them with the destruction of their church buildings. But in New York, they have a very strict regulation as well on churches. And so a pastor said enough is enough and began to open. On the first Sunday, Rick, that he opened, a man was intent on committing suicide. Depression is up, anxiety is up, all kinds of things are happening, loss of job, uncertainty. There have been more suicides in one of the counties in California in 1 month than there have been in the entire year on average in this one county. And that's happening all over the country. It's absolutely astounding. This man was on his way to end his life. He drove by this church. He's not a member. He saw the church was open. He saw some cars in the parking lot. It was on a Sunday. And so he stopped. He thought, maybe I could get some help here. And he met the pastor. And the pastor gave him counsel, comfort, and gave him the hope of Jesus Christ. And that averted this man from committing suicide. Now, that's just one. We have a church in Maine. We represent Pastor Ken Graves, and you probably know.
I do know Ken.
Very solid, strong pastor. Same thing. Maine says no service, not even parking lot. So they've been doing online, and they ended up saying, well, we're going to start some in-person service. Well, Maine actually has a process that says, well, at some point in time, we're going to allow churches to have 10 people. but we're not quite there yet. And in fact, when we get there, you're going to have to apply. Churches will have to apply. And then you'll get a badge for approval. And you'll have to put that badge on the outside of your church door.
It's not a Star of David, is it?
We don't know what it looks like yet, but it's a badge. It's a badge that you have to put on the outside of your building showing that you're approved to meet, that you've gone through the application process and approved to meet. So we actually, as we're speaking, we just finished our reply brief on that. It's at the Court of Appeals. It's also being expedited at the First Circuit Court of Appeals. We have a case in Virginia. In that case, Lighthouse Fellowship Church. It does not have internet, Rick. It has no internet, and many of the members have no internet. Some of these people came from prostitution. They've been redeemed from prostitution or drug addiction. They rely upon this church as their family. The church takes some of these people to medical treatments, helps them fill out different forms. They don't have internet. Some do, many don't. So when they shut their doors, they have no alternative. So on Palm Sunday, they went to a church. They had 16 people, 16 people in a 293-seat sanctuary. 6 people over Governor Northam's magic number of 10. The police came and charged the pastor with a criminal misdemeanor punishable by up to a year in prison and a $2,500 fine. And they told the other 15 people, if you come back for Easter, we will criminally charge every one of you. And so they were so fearful they didn't have an Easter service and no alternative. We're litigating there. The U.S. Department of Justice has filed a brief in our support. We also have a case in Kentucky, and I'll conclude with this one. It's a case in Kentucky where the governor said no services at all. And the church originally did some service, and they did a parking lot. They did a modified, very small number of people inside a 700-seat sanctuary and a parking lot service on Easter Sunday. But it wasn't the people inside that was the issue. The governor said on Good Friday, if anybody goes to any church on Easter, I will send out the police, take your license plates number, and issue you notices of quarantine. And so the governor did. They sent 2 police officers to the parking lot. They went car to car to car, and they gave them the notices of citation, took down all their information, their VIN number, license plate number, gave them all the information. While they're in their cars, listening to the pastor on the loudspeaker, in their cars, windows rolled up, gave them a notice of quarantine. That was on a Sunday. Some of the people, when it hit the media on Monday, Tuesday, when they went back to work, they were asked, don't you attend Maryville Baptist Church? And they said, yes. And they were terminated. Some of them were terminated immediately because they had, in the paper, anybody who was there that Sunday got the notices of quarantine. So they were terminated without any cause other than what came out in the paper. A few days later, the governor sent them all a letter and said that you and all your occupants and anybody you came in contact with had to self-quarantine for 14 days. You had to take your temperature at the same time every day and report it to the County Board of Health. And you couldn't travel out of the county without permission. So we filed a federal lawsuit. We got a 3-0 decision at the Federal Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And they ultimately ruled 3-0. First, on a Saturday afternoon, they gave us the opinion for parking lot services. And then second, the next Saturday afternoon for in-person services, 3-0. So that is one of the great decisions out there. But there's a lot of pastors still struggling in states that are very restrictive.
Man,
Rick, is we created a webpage called reopenchurch.org, reopenchurch.org. It's on our lc.org system, but it's reopenchurch.org. And that
we'll link to that site, by the way, from our website.
Okay.
And promote that.
And that actually gives some ideas for how do you begin the process of reopening church. Let me just conclude with this one thing, and then I want to sandwich it in and open it up for Q&A. There's a lot of churches that are reopening that haven't opened on Pentecost. A lot of them have already opened, and they're having amazing experiences. But the first pastor who got arrested is Dr. Rodney Howard Brown of the River at Tampa Bay.
Yeah, I preached for him. I know him.
Yeah, and he got arrested on Monday after he had the Sunday service. That Sunday service was actually approved by the same sheriff that arrested him, believe it or not. On Thursday, they talked to the sheriff, said, fine, all that you're doing looks good, gave him the green light. But there's a lesbian mayor in Tampa that ultimately got really mad when he met on that Sunday. This was early on. It was the last Sunday of March, and he got arrested on Monday. Well, what has happened since then is that sheriff has reached out to the pastor and had a 3-hour meeting at the pastor's home. And the pastor forgave him.
Wow.
And the pastor has invited the sheriff, and the sheriff has accepted the invitation to come to the River Church at Tampa Bay and come on the platform where the pastor will openly forgive him and the congregation will openly forgive and this particular sheriff that literally damaged him and caused him to have death threats and the church to have bomb threats. It's an unbelievable picture of reconciliation. But this Sunday, the church is opening with an outdoor service called The Stand. And they've taken their parking lot, and they literally just, even today, they put AstroTurf on that parking lot. And they can accommodate up to 8,000 to 10,000 people there. They've already got 2,800 people registered for this Sunday.
Wow.
And it's going to be outdoors. You bring your own chairs. They'll have food trucks there. They'll have porta potties. You do the social distancing if you want to, but it's going to be up to you. You have to pre-register. They already have 2,800 people registered. They'll have more than that as they get there. And they'll have an outdoor service on Pentecost, and they're going to continue it every night of the week and maybe go on for however the Lord wants them to go on, maybe a month doing that throughout the week. 5:30 in the evening every night, but they're starting their service on Sunday on Pentecost. And it's just been an amazing situation how that pastor who caught the world's attention ultimately resulted in freeing up Florida, because a day and a half after, the governor issued an executive order saying attendance at churches, synagogues, and houses of worship is essential activity. And that freed up every church in Florida. Since then, there have been no restrictions on churches in the state of Florida. But let me get back to where I was at the beginning. What I see is a pattern. And that pattern has been very consistent. And it is a pattern of worldview. And it's not only consistent with what you see happening at the state level with the governors, but also what you're seeing happening at the local level with the mayors and the other governing bodies. And that is a worldview. And the people that are making those draconian restrictions and that are restricting churches and making other kinds of unreasonable restrictions on our freedom, those are individuals that have also a very radical pro-abortion worldview, a pro-LGBT worldview, and an anti-religious liberty worldview. So when you're talking with the Jonathan Project, all that you're doing, Rick, what you're doing is so critical to encourage pastors to get people registered to vote and to do it in a way that's data-driven and to preach and give values to the people so they vote values. Because we don't want to have to ever go through this again. How do we prevent it? Well, we're doing litigation, sure. But just as much as the litigation, we need even more so to have people in office who respect our religious freedom and our freedom in general. The only way they're going to do that is if people vote biblical values and elect the right people into office, so that we never want to go down this road again, Rick. And thank you for all you're doing, because what you're doing is so, so critical.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, you're both a theologian. You have a theologically trained mind and an incredibly bright legal mind. As I see it, I want you to take this and run with it for as long as you need to. As I see it, if pastors don't stand up right now, and if the church doesn't engage and confront this insidious infringement upon our rights as unique citizens of a free society, we have a citizenship in heaven, but we also have a citizenship here on earth. And just like Paul, when he was in the Philippian jail, and finally God miraculously shook the jail cell, and he's standing now with the liberty to leave. Rather than leave, he says, I'm a Roman citizen. And he took his citizenship rights as a Roman and said, you beat me without a charge, you defied our own laws, and I demand that this be rectified. And because of his strong stand, jeopardizing his future freedom, he could have been just run out of town and executed. They could have easily done that to him. Rather than flee and and take his liberty and go to the next town. He stood on his citizenship rights. But that brought a revival to Philippi. It resulted in the strongest church that we have in the New Testament, the only church that was still standing with Paul in the end when he was hauled off to Rome. I see this as a time where either the church engages and we see a sweeping revival come out of this, or we meekly lay aside our rights and the Antichrist begins imposing his tyranny on the world, because America is the last bastion of freedom. I'm kind of throwing you a softball, but talk about that just for a moment.
Well, yeah, let me answer that in a couple of different ways. When we pushed back, and I pushed back very early on all these restrictions, and I got heat for it. But a lot of people have realized how problematic these are. Some people still haven't, but many have. But also I got Romans 13 thrown up at me. And, Romans 13 was used as a favorite scripture by the pastors in Nazi Germany in 1933.
Exactly.
A famous speech by a pastor there. And he invited all the Nazi people with all the Nazi flags, and he spoke on Romans 13. Romans 13, 7 verses 1 through 7, says that government is established by God, but what's the purpose for it? It says it's established by God to protect the good and punish the evildoer.
That's right.
If you don't want to be receiving the wrath of government, then do good and show them by your good works so that you silence everybody. It says, therefore, you have people that collect taxes, so give taxes to where taxes is due. Similar comment, or similar statement, I should say, in the scriptures in 1 Peter as well. It's very similar to what Jesus said in Matthew 22:21, but there's a very interesting aspect to it, because he was asked, what about Caesar? Do we have to pay taxes to him or not? It was a trick question. And they wanted him to say no, so that they would consider him a rebel rouser. And he said, well, whose inscription is it? It's Caesar's. He says, well, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Many people stop with that. But the rest of it is, and render to God that which belongs to God. Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. The church does not belong to Caesar.
That's
never
right.
has. The king had his own jurisdiction in the Old Testament, and the priest had his own jurisdiction.
Correct.
And they didn't cross. In fact, if you look at 1 Samuel 13, it's because Samuel, the king, exercised the duties of a priest that ultimately led to his downfall. And Samuel confronted him and said, because you've done this, because you entered and you did these sacrifices, God will ultimately reject you, and he's going to find someone else after his own heart. And of course, he raised up King David. So, that's a very important scriptural point. But on the other hand, with regards to our freedom, this is an attack on the church. And why is it an attack on the church? It's an attack on the church because it is the last bastion. I see that Rafael Cruz is on here. Rafael knows this. He's come from communist Cuba before. He knows this. Anybody who studied this knows this. What's the first thing that repressive regimes, communist countries want to attack? The church. Why?
Correct.
Because the church is the one that's going to stand for liberty. Because of the liberty in Christ, we stand for liberty externally as well. Because of the liberty and freedom we have internally, we also believe that God created us as individual human beings in his image, and no repressive government should ultimately take away and control that individual. So the church is always standing against freedom. Look, this is not just about COVID-19. COVID-19 brought this up, but we're into a major global threat against freedom. People like Bill Gates are leading this. Bill Gates' father was a eugenicist. He was president of Planned Parenthood. The president before him became the president of the Alan Guttmacher Institute, and they changed the words eugenics to population control because it got some bad name back then. Population control, eugenics were widespread. Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Nazi Germany. And it's not just population control, it's controlling the kind of population, eliminating certain people within the population, because they're also social Darwinianists. They believed in evolution of humanity to a greater superhuman race. And how do you do that? You weed out the people you don't want that are not good. And the inferior races which is right out of Darwinism, and you begin to eliminate through population control certain segments of the society that procreate and pollute the pool, the gene pool. Bill Gates is one of those individuals. Why does he want to have mandatory worldwide vaccinations? Why does he want to have tracing, testing, and all that? Why does he have his funding arms in all of these different entities globally? I mean, he's got every area that you can imagine where he is funding it. And why, for example, do the talking points come to 12 to 18 months? Because they're coming from Gates and people like Gates, like the 12 to 18 months in Illinois. Where does the governor get those talking points? It's from the Gates organizations. Gates wants to force 7.5 billion people on the planet to be vaccinated with the COVID-19. Gates has specifically said, and this is his own words, that if you have a 1 in 10,000 adverse reaction, because you can't tell how this vaccine would work across the board from young to old and different health conditions, predispositions, nourishment levels, and so forth. So you're going to have deaths. And he said, assume that you have a 1 in 10,000, that's 750,000 deaths. He's willing to accept worldwide to vaccinate every single person on the planet. And so this whole issue, and it's not just to give you better health, because he wants to reduce world population by 10 to 15%. It's to weed out the population. And he knows that people will be collateral damage in the process, but that's okay to him because he's that social Darwinianist. And what you see happening in all the states, including, Rick, your state, you wouldn't think that Texas would be doing this. They're doing the tracing.
That's right.
And the governor's already appropriated $400,000 to that.
That's right, 395,000.
495,000,
395,000.
And that's Texas. I'm talking about every state, all 50 states.
Excuse me, 395 million. I was a little off on that.
And they're looking at even, and other states are even more. So what are they doing? They want to create a tracking system so that every one of your movements is tracked. And they know exactly who you've been in contact with. And that they could quarantine you 14 days repeatedly until you ultimately get out of that endless loop by getting the most recent vaccine. In this case, it's COVID-19, but there's going to be another one after that and another one after that. In India right now, they're requiring a mandatory app. Well, they're requiring an app. They say it's voluntary. But if you want to buy groceries, you want to go to a theater, you want to get on an airplane, you have to show that. So it's really not voluntary. And that app traces every movement. Now, the church is going to stand against that kind of repression of freedom because this is global control of humanity. It is ultimately social Darwinianism put upon steroids. And that's why the church is under attack. And so we need to understand the context in which all this is happening. And it's not just this COVID-19, because there's something after COVID-19. And this is a bigger agenda that's been in the works for a long time. It's just been advanced with this panic that they have imposed on people globally with the COVID-19 scare.
Well, brace yourself now. I've got a question from your and my good friend, Dran Reese. And she asked this question: where do you see us in the timeline of history? So put your theological hat on for that one, Matt.
Well, you know, you could go on that for a long time. I don't know. I'm not a prophet to tell you exactly where we are in the timeline of history. But if I had a graph, I would, and this was the beginning and this was the end, I would be somewhere down towards the end. Where we are, I don't know how far we are to that. But I can tell you that.
Let me rescue just a little bit and interject what I think about that. I really think that we can determine where we are in that timeline. Either the church is going to lay down and everything exponentially moves forward to the reign of the Antichrist, or we do the very thing that's spoken of in 1 Chronicles 7:14. That, by the way, that whole chapter leads up to 14. But when the plagues come and the droughts come and the weather patterns suddenly turn violent, he says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn not from the world's wicked ways, but the church's wicked ways, they'll hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. You know, there is one bright ray of hope, folks, all of you listening, in the book of Matthew, when all the end time events are enumerated, when he says, this gospel shall be preached to the ends of the earth, then shall the end come. I see there a pause if the church takes the mantle of repentance and gets serious about the gospel. And I believe God withholds the judgment so the gospel can spread like a wildfire. We will determine part of this ourselves. And it's the American church primarily that's going to determine that, because we have the light. We have the gospel preached in such freedom up until this point. Will we stand around these legal issues, but more importantly, spiritual issues, or are we going to just acquiesce and say anything for my personal safety, anything for my personal comfort? Yeah. We either stand or we don't, and this is our hour. Matt, I'll let you.
Well, Rick, you know, we got a great example in the scriptures with Assyria in the book of Jonah.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
That judgment was averted because they repented.
In fact, it made the preacher mad because he felt like his prophecy
mad because made him look like he wasn't actually saying the right things, because the judgment he had pronounced didn't happen. Didn't happen because they ultimately repented. So I think you're exactly right. That's why it's so important what you're doing with the Jonathan Project, to encourage pastors to speak up on values. And it's not just getting them registered to vote. You have to give them the biblical values so that they have the biblical worldview, so that they know how to vote, and they can then figure out who to vote for if you let them know where these candidates stand and how they align or don't align with your biblical values that you're teaching them. Then you get out there and vote. That's how you ultimately change our culture.
Yeah, if people will go to our website, jptexas.org, they'll see a whole month of Bible study materials designed for small groups or Sunday school. And what we urge and encourage the churches that really line up with us is to set aside a month and teach their people some basics about our godly heritage, about our Christian worldview, so that they then can be discerning when they vote. So we offer free educational materials too, and they're state of the art. So thank you for commending that, Matt. We're going to run up against a deadline on the time we have for this Zoom call. I want to give you just a few moments for some closing thoughts. There are several people in our chat room, and I'll say to you guys in the chat room, if you'll send your questions to Jonathan Project, jptexas.org/conference, That's right, I said that wrong. jptexas.org/contact. We're monitoring that, and we'll get back to you with information that you request or answers to your questions. But because of Matt's schedule, because of the length of time we've reserved for the call, we need to wrap this up. Matt, take a few minutes and close us out if you would.
Well, thank you. And Dran, you're chairman of or president of the Salt and Light Council, and being in California, there's a video that just came out of someone who actually attended a 9-hour training, got 2 certificates for a contact tracer. She wasn't wanting to be a contact tracer, but she went through the training, and she shares what she learned in that training. It is frightening. It's shocking to see what is happening and what is being planned on a mass, talking about a mass scale. So Rick, I just want to encourage, all the people that are here, pastors, those that work with churches, community leaders, and so forth. I just want to encourage you to, this is a critical time. I never thought as we began 2020, we'd be here today. I never thought that we would be comparing the safety. In fact, we actually just filed a brief, and they were arguing how it's unsafe. The Attorney General of Maine, for Janet Mills, arguing how it's terrible, it's unsafe to go to church. And a friend of ours filed an amicus brief in the case, and they were comparing how it's safer to go to church than it is to go to a liquor store. And I sent him an email and said, I never thought we'd be comparing going to church being safer than going to a liquor store. It certainly is, of course, but the fact of the matter is that liquor stores, think about it, marijuana dispensaries are considered essential. Liquor stores considered essential. Abortion clinics considered essential. Wow. But churches are not in many of these places around the country. Let me just close with this. What I see happening, not only in America and around the world, is literally heartbreaking. I got calls, and I've been getting calls on things. Yesterday, a 91-year-old mother her mother, got sick, had to go to the hospital with some severe headaches. Looked like there was some imbalance in her body. They did not want to put her in the hospital. When she called people, they came to the house. She didn't have any COVID. And they said, well, because of the COVID in the hospitals, you don't want to go in and have any treatment. So they delayed treatment against the daughter's wishes. It got worse. She ended up admitting her to the hospital. And the ambulance came and took her to the hospital, I should say. And what they did was they put her in the COVID section. This was a 91-year-old woman who needed some help. She wasn't COVID. When the daughter found out, she was livid. She says, why didn't you tell me? She said, it's standard procedure. Anybody who comes in, they go into the COVID section, they get tested. And if they don't have COVID, once the tests come back, they get moved out. This is a 91-year-old woman. And they put her in a COVID section. They tested her, but it took a couple days for that test to come back. So she's in a COVID section with other people who are COVID positive. And she comes back with a negative test. And then as they're wheeling her from the COVID section of the hospital to the place where they're going to give her the medical service, because they're not going to do anything on her until she's not COVID positive. She dies in the process, alone, with the family not there, because the family was prohibited from coming. I see so much tragedy happening right now, so much tragedy happening. It is unbearable. And it's worldwide. It's not just in America, it's worldwide, and it's worse in some other places. But the incidents of child abuse are escalating. Domestic abuse, skyrocketing. Child sexual exploitation on the rise, exponential. I'm talking about off the chart. Increase of pornography. In India, it increased 95% in a week during the first week of lockdowns, because people are at home. Their anxiety is up. The increase in anxiety medication, depressive medication, prescription medication, suicide, all these very high up. Those are things you can't do online. You can't comfort a family who's going through that kind of situation online. You don't even know they exist. So I'm encouraging pastors to really begin to look at what's happening and be bold and begin that process of reopening the church. And let's never, ever, ever allow this to happen.
That's right.
Again. And the best way to do it is make sure you teach your people and you register them to vote and you get them to the polls. And when they go there, you are confident that they can vote biblical values because you invested that time and information into them and change the landscape of these elected officials. Yes. And that's how we prevent this from happening again.
Let me just finally say thank you so much, Matt, for the information, for your stand, for your courage. Those of you that are leaders in churches, get in touch with us. Let us explain to you what we will do for you. The reason we called this the Jonathan Project, not I, but Mr. Hershon, is he said, I want this ministry to be the friend to the anointed, just like Jonathan was the friend to the anointed David, set aside to be the ruler of all of Israel. Pastors are set aside to be the leaders of their churches. You've got your hands full. So if you will let us, we'll be your friend. We'll come alongside. We're not looking for notoriety. We're not looking for money. God is taking care of us. Everything we do is free. We just want to help you get your people registered, because those who have a biblical understanding are the ones that are going to redeem this culture. Their silence is killing this culture. It's time to mix church and state God's way. So if you'll get in touch with us at jptexas.org, let us know. Just go to the info tab and let us know that you want somebody to contact you. Or you can contact me personally. Here it is, rs@jonathanproject.org. rs@jonathanproject.org comes directly to me. And within 48 hours, someone on our staff or I personally will be in touch with you. Matt Staver, you are in our prayers. Thank you for this time today. This concludes our call, and may God bless all of you. You can go to our website and get and watch this by this time tomorrow. It will be posted. Share a link. Get other people to listen to this important and urgent message that has been given to us by Matt Staver. His website is lc.org. Is that correct, Matt?
lc.org. That's correct, Rick.
lc.org. Get in touch with Matt. lc, as in Liberty Counsel.org. God bless all.